My name is Arpit Chaturvedi. I'm the CEO of Global Policy Insights and really excited to welcome you in this Indian Women for International Relations webinar, which is a program that we have started at Global Policy Insights. Today's discussion is on a very important topic. It's on India, China, and the great power competition, about its strategic considerations and geopolitical challenges. We have an illustrious panel joining us today. I will be doing the panel introductions very soon, but before that, a few housekeeping tips. Number one is that at all times, while the panel discussion is on, I would request everybody to keep their videos on off, except for the speakers, and your microphones on mute. The chat box will be muted or it'll be closed for at least the first half an hour, after which you can start, we'll open out the chat box for you. You can start adding your questions in there, and we'll take your questions one by one after the discussion is over in about an hour from now. We will also, once we select your question, we're going to unmute you and we're going to allow you to ask your question yourself. Please keep your questions brief and pointed. Please do point out the speaker to whom you're asking the question. The overall format of this is going to be as follows. I'm going to ask a question to each speaker individually first, and we'll have 10 minutes to answer the question. After which, we'll move on to the next speaker. And once all three speakers have given their opening remarks, I will ask some follow-up questions, after which we will take questions from the audience. With this, I think it's time for me to request Sylvia to step in and introduce the Indian Women for International Relations program. That's our latest initiative from Global Policy Insights. Sylvia, if you could share the vision and what we are trying to do with the IWIR program, that'll be great. Over to you, Sylvia.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sylvia Mishra, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the Indian Women in International Relations. We are extremely proud and happy that this is our launch event. And I'm so pleased that we have such a distinguished panel. And I'm really also pleased to see so many familiar faces of friends and colleagues from Delhi and elsewhere. We started IWIR with the vision that it is important to showcase the talent, the scholarship of Indian women in international relations and international political economy. The idea also was to further bolster young talents, showcase their young scholars' work and publications. And one of the third important vision, which was one of the motivating reasons why we built out this network, was to provide a platform where younger scholars can interact with more senior scholars, essentially to create a structure of mentorship and build mentor-mentee relationships within this framework. So with that vision and mission, we set out, and this is our launch event, and we're extremely proud and happy to see y'all in this. I'm hoping with this, y'all will keep connected to IWIR through GPI's initiative. And I look forward to continuing our conversation and generating new ideas within the structures of this framework. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sylvia. So we are also going to be posting our social media links, etc., in the chat box so that you can follow IWIR and GPI. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panel over here who has joined us for today's discussion. First, joining us is Dr. Rajeshwari Pillai Gopalan, or whom we dearly call Raji. Dr. Gopalan is a distinguished fellow and heads the Nuclear and Space Initiative at the Observer Research Foundation. She's also a non-resident Indo-Pacific Fellow at the Perth, USA Asia Center. She was also the technical advisor to a new United Nations group of government experts, the GGE, on prevention of arms race in outer space. As a senior Asia defense writer for The Diplomat, she writes a weekly column on Asian strategic issues. Dr. Rajagopalan joined ORF after a 5-year stint at the National Security Council Secretariat, Government of India, where she was an assistant director. And prior to joining that, she was a research officer at the Indian Defense Studies Analysis, New Delhi. She was also a visiting professor at the Graduate Institute of International Politics, National Chung Ching University, Taiwan in 2012. She has authored or edited 9 books, including Global Nuclear Security, Moving Beyond NSS, Space Policy 2.0, and National Security in India, Clashing Titans, Military Strategy, and Insecurity Among Asian Great Powers. She has been invited to speak at international fora, including the United Nations Disarmament Forum, the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, Conference on Disarmament, ASEAN Regional Forum, and the European Union. Raji, thanks a lot for joining us. We are looking forward to hearing from you today.
Thank you for having me here. Thank you.
And our next speaker is Professor Amitav Mathu. Professor Mathu and I, we have known each other for almost an year now, and I've had some fascinating conversations with him. He's presently a professor at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and the professor of international relations at the University of Melbourne. He co-chairs the Australia-India Leadership Dialogue and was foundation director of the Australia Institute and serves on its board. He is currently the chairman of Miranda House, the top-ranking college in India, and was an advisor with cabinet rank to the Chief Minister of Jammu Kashmir. He was awarded the prestigious Padma Shri Award for his contribution to education and public life in 2008. Professor Mathu is also the commissioner of Lancet Commission on Adolescent Health and Well-being. He has been a member of the National Knowledge Commission, a high-level advisory group to the Prime Minister of India, and the National Security Council's advisory board. He's a member of the Executive Committee and Governing Council of the Pugwash Conference on Science and World Affairs and chaired the Jammu and Kashmir State Knowledge Initiative. Professor Mathu was also the Vice Chancellor of Jammu University. He received his doctorate from Oxford University and has been a visiting professor at Stanford University, University of Notre Dame, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Thank you so much, Professor Mathu, for joining us. So good to see you here, sir.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, sir. And we have my friend Sylvia Mishra joining us from Washington, D.C. Sylvia's research focuses on nuclear strategy and non-proliferation. She's an expert in South Asian security and emerging and disruptive technologies. She leads the CBRN working group for WCAPS and is a mid-career cadre scholar at CSIS. Sylvia was an India-US fellow at New America Accelerator Initiative at the Stanley Center for Peace and Security. She was also a Scoville Fellow at the Nuclear Threat Initiative, visiting fellow at the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, and a Carnegie New Leader. She worked in New Delhi at the Observer Research Foundation on the India-US defense and security ties. Sylvia is also a co-chair of the Indian Women in International Relations Forum. Sylvia, thank you for your leadership behind this initiative, and we are glad to have you here, and we are looking forward to hearing from you today.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here.
Okay, thank you so much. Now, I'm going to start with my question to Professor Rajagopalan. Professor Rajagopalan, amidst these tensions between India and China, which have been exacerbated with, in the context of the coronavirus, I wanted to understand from you that is there a grand strategy in India's China policy? And broadly, if you could give us a perspective on whether from Doklam to Galwan, what are the continuities and shifts in India's preparation to deal with the Chinese threat?
Thank you. Thank you, Arpit. Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Arpit. Thanks very much for having me here. This is a fantastic initiative that you have taken. So many congratulations to the IWIR. And it's also great to see my friends like Sylvia being part of this and taking the lead in some of these initiatives. I think this is 2020. We need such initiatives. And it's at one level, it is very hard to imagine that we still have to fight it out to kind of get the women voice out heard. But I think we need to persevere, be perseverant and continue our efforts on a day-to-day basis in a sense. And thank you to both Arpit and Sylvia for taking the lead in this regard. Coming to the question, and I think it's a perfect time to debate some of these issues, especially in the post-Galvin scenario. I think there have been, this is called the game changer moment in India's foreign policy, in India's approach to China, and so on and so forth. So I think it's a good time to take stock of where we are, where we have gone, or have we been right about China in making certain assumptions. So to come to the first question, I think there is whether there has been a grand strategy. I think that's the first question. And if there has been a grand strategy, did we get it right, and did we go wrong somewhere? I think there has been some sense that things have not been exactly the way that India planned vis-a-vis China in our policy. And one of the indicators is that we do clearly see a lot of senior officials, at least recently retired officials, talking about calling for a fresh approach to a fresh look at a review of the India's China policy. That does indicate that there has not been, something has gone wrong, or something was not right with the policy, or some sort of a failure in how India approached China, and therefore there is there's a call for a fresh review and a sort of a fresh approach to looking at China policy. And here again, I think most recently you had the recently retired ambassador Syed Akbaruddin, who actually wrote in one of the columns saying that China has to be looked at in a very different fashion, and how we need to relook at this policy. Another senior person, in fact, the last foreign secretary, Ambassador Vijay Gokhale, again has been writing a series of columns where he has asked for a fundamental shift in India's approach to China in a sense. And he has been particularly quite harsh about China. And again, these are not people who have had a sort of a hard line on China, or even who have actually maintained a fairly nuanced approach to China. And another person I would think is Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon, former foreign secretary and former national security advisor, again, who has continued to now say that this time around China poses itself as a major problem. Things are very different. It's a lot more serious. So there is clearly an understanding. And I think this is something slightly different from the public perception. Public perception regarding China has not been particularly, the voting has not been particularly high for China. On the other hand, they always voted very favorably towards the US, whether it is the Pew survey or even other surveys. But when it comes to China, you have a very different approach. And but today, I think what is more remarkable is this opinion shift in the opinions among the elites, among the more senior officials who recently retired. So they still, I would think, who have actually now maintained that there is a call for a sort of either again Ambassador Gautam Bambawale, who held the East Asia desk at the MEA, as well as an ambassador in China, who again called for a fundamental change in India's China policy. So it seems that some things have not been going right with the China policy, and we need to have a fresh approach. And there can be any number of mixes and matches in terms of whether we deal with it in economic terms, diplomatically, or military terms, and so on and so forth. So at the same time, none of the officials I talked about, they haven't said there has been a failure in the China policy. But the fact is that, and that admission is not going to come through, but the very fact that they're calling for a shift in India's policy approach to China does indicate that there has been some sort of a failure, and it is time for us to have a new approach. And that brings me to the point about Doklam, and where did we get the readings right? Did we take the signals right from the Doklam crisis? And I would think that the establishment did not really do so. It does appear that Doklam, to me, it appears that India did look at Doklam as an aberration, and not really, it was a break, it was an aberration, and that China was something that we could still continue continue to build economic and other ties. But Doklam was a one-off incident. Although many in the strategy community did believe that Doklam was not the first and the last of it. This was just the beginning of the new aggressive China that you're seeing. But I don't think many in the establishment believe that kind of an approach. And that's why you did see they wanted to continue or resume the ties, so to say. And therefore, you had the informal summits, both the Wuhan and the Mamallapuram summits you have had. But I don't believe that they've yielded anything really for the India-China relations, so to say. And I think that that's to be taken back to, there can be any number of reasons as to why China is being aggressive. There are different reasoning, but to me, I think one of the stark pointers is that the huge power differential between India and China, and that's at the root of it. The power difference has become so remarkable that China does believe that it can take on anybody from in the neighborhood to Canada to Australia to Sweden and others. So they have been on this kind of a extremely aggressive behavior towards all of its neighbors, starting from South China Sea, East China Sea, and of course Indian border as well. We have seen this. Then, of course, you have a nation that is so paranoia, for instance. And I think at least to go by some of the Chinese analysts, scholars who have written on this particular aspect as to try and finding out a logic behind the Galvin clash and so on and so forth. It doesn't give you a very clear picture as to why China is doing what it is doing. But if I were to take some of these writings into account, it does seem like China is extremely paranoid. If that is the case, if there is very little that India can do or others can do to sort of manage the situation, or to have because we already have been dealing with one paranoia state on our left, and now we have another paranoia state on the right, and I'm not sure we have the right recipe or right formula to kind of manage the two neighbors in that sense. And now coming to so the next logical question should be like, what do we do now? Where do we go from here? Where does the Indian policy approach to China go from here? And I think there have been called for sort of re-energizing the Quad, for instance. For instance, some of the officials like Ambassador Gautam Bambawale have talked about sort of taking it to a higher level. We've already upgraded the Quad to a ministerial level talks. That itself, from the officials to ministerial level, that itself does show a certain amount of commitment from all the Quad countries, including India, that does tend to sit on the fence from time to time. So Quad ministerial talks are already happening, and there could be more focused discussions and so on and so forth. But I think if we were to read and look at some of the External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar's recent statements and speeches, it does give you a feeling that India is still trying to look for a certain amount of space, sort of a bargaining space, looking for certain choices and certain options. He talks about multipolarity and so on and so forth. So it does seem that India is still not ready all the way to embrace a group of countries. I'm not saying alliance in the traditional form, but some sort of an alliance in the making. It does seem that we still want some sort of a maneuvering space to create more strategic choices for India. Our recent engagement with the RIC, the Russia-India-China grouping, our recent engagement in the BRICS, for instance, or the NAM, the non-alignment movement. For 2 years, for instance, Modi never attended the summit ever since he came into office. There were 2 summits in the past, he never attended, but the third one is just being held in a virtual manner, and Modi did take part this year, early in the year. So it does not give you a very clear perspective on where does India sit when it comes to, so even on the diplomatic front, I think there are issues to deal with, and it's not very clear that India itself is very clear about where it wants to go. I think the diplomatic options are also somewhat more complicated because of the Russia angle. Because I think there have been some efforts at building sort of some bridge with Russia. There have been talks about whether Russia can be co-opted into the Indo-Pacific, whether Russia accepts it or not. The Indo-Pacific, they have not been in the past. Whether Russia would accept the Indo-Pacific concept itself and endorse that, because that's one way, at least many Indian officials and others do see it as a way to kind of create a rift between Russia and China. Whether that is going to be successful or not, that is the one problem. But there is also a bigger problem given the deteriorating relations between Russia and the Western countries in a sense. So that also complicates India's own diplomatic efforts to manage China. Then you have of course, the military option. That's something being talked about. But again, whether India would ever take an offensive action against China, because I think India's posture has always been a defensively oriented one. So whether India has the capability, but given the current Galvan clash and the disengagement process has not gone very well so far, it does seem that India might want to build up the deployment, the military strength along the line of actual control along the border. But how far India can do that, I think that's part of the problem. If the incursions don't stop, not transgressions, incursions don't stop on the Sino-Indian border or the Sino-Indian-Tibetan border, then there are going to be serious problems in terms of India's ability to manage the troop deployment. Because essentially we are looking at 2.5 scenario. We have a Pakistan-India, Pakistan LOC. We have now an LAC, which is now no more predictable in terms of what might happen. And then of course we have the internal insurgencies and so on and so forth. So looking at a 2.5 conflict scenario, whether we have adequate number of forces to sort of devote on a continuous basis on the LAC, that's a question. So I think there are issues of this kind that does complicate matters for India, but I think let me stop here and I'll be happy to take
Sure. Thank you so much, Raji. And just to add to that, now we also have Nepal and some conflicts arising from there. But one quick follow-up question on what you said. You mentioned Quad and Quad Plus.
Yeah.
Now, in the absence of any cultural similarities or ties between these 4 Quad countries, how resilient do you think can Quad emerge as a security community, if at all?
Sure. No, I think that's a terrific question. I think that's always been a question in terms of the ability of these kind of smaller multilaterals and kind of thing to survive when you don't have a socio-cultural glue to kind of keep them together. But I think here the biggest glue has been this China factor. And I think the fact that you had a Quad in the first time in 2007, and it withered away. But the fact that it came back in a second avatar it's taken, it's clear that the initial challenges and concerns that had been posed to these 4 countries have not only not gone away, but they have intensified, and therefore you are seeing the 4 countries coming back together a second time. Second, the upgradation of the meeting to a ministerial level again shows the commitment among all the 4 countries. And here again, I would add one more point. For instance, I think in terms of India's diplomatic options, again, whether this would manage the Sino-Indian border issue directly, it's a question. But the fact that now Australia is being considered to to let in for the Malabar exercise. But the Malabar naval exercise, initially India-US, now from 2015 onwards, Japan is a regular partner. And whether we are willing to and ready to kind of get Australia into that grouping, again, is something very interesting. And to me, I think that seems like a very logical option, because if you do think Australia is a legitimate security partner for you, engage them in as many different platforms as possible. I don't think you need to limit them to one particular block and say, yeah, we do engage with you on the Quad, and therefore we needn't engage with you. So my own sense is that we need to create more options. You also have the Quad Plus, for instance. Quad Plus with the inclusion of South Korea, New Zealand, and Vietnam. They are currently engaged in a COVID situation. The COVID-related issues are the focus point for them. But the fact is that you should remember 2004, 2005, when the Quad came in the first time, it was a tsunami that provided the initial momentum for these 4 countries to come together. So maybe COVID is going to be that momentum provider in that sense, because each of these countries have to bear the brunt of China's aggressive behavior in their own backyard. New Zealand provides the best example. In a sense, they have had to deal with the Chinese aggressive behavior in their own backyard, and they're very, very similar to Indian approach in a sense. They sat on the fence for the longest time, not to take a clear position between the US and China. But I think finally, just like India, even these countries are beginning to take a clear side. Hedging is no more a kind of a strategy for many of these countries, just like India's, for instance.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Raji. I'm going to bring the discussion back to the borders again. And my question is to Dr. Mathu. So, Dr. Mathu, one fundamental question is that, are border disputes always violent, or is it the nature of the international politics that turns them violent? So, is it, there is a border issue between India and China, and that's why there is violence, or there is animosity which has grown between the country, and that translates into violence over there? And in that context, do you think that India is going to revise its, Himalayan border strategy and its whole approach towards Tibet?
Let me first of all thank you for inviting me to this inaugural event. I wish you great luck, and congratulations to Sylvia and her co-chair for setting up the Indian Women in International Relations. I think we need many more voices of women in international relations, and you can see that there are far too many manuals, as you people point out, especially they become starkly obvious when you have them on webinars and so on. So I think women often add a much more powerful perspective, a different perspective often. I remember studying the Greenham Common, which was a nuclear opposition group set up by women in England. And some of the readings were atypical. I mean, you couldn't stereotype many of the voices that came out of Greenham Common. So I think even within India, there's a whole spectrum of opinion within women, but it's important to let those voices be heard much more powerfully than they are today. And certainly the School of International Studies, which is my principal employer at the moment, that tries to definitely give more weight to women's voices. And in terms of the faculty itself, I think a large section of the faculty is of women, probably at least 1/3 of the faculty in SIS is of women. So I'm glad that Sylvia is started this. Sylvia's father himself is a very distinguished professor of international relations. I seem to be, as I was telling someone, cutting across generations, because her father and I were batchmates in JNU. So she's now a younger scholar in some ways, even though you can't be ageist about anything, but tells you how the world has changed. But to answer your question, and since you've asked me not to, and since this is a kind of comfortable discussion, not given rapid fire comments and not intended as prime time television, one can be a little more relaxed in terms of answering your question. There is no clear answer. If you look at the body of evidence, historically speaking, borders have served as symptoms of conflict. Sometimes they've served as causes of conflict, and sometimes they've served as bridges. So you've had all three. Look at borders as bridges which were once sources of conflict. Alsace-Lorraine between France and Germany, a source of conflict since the Napoleonic Wars onwards. There was this tiny piece of land which everyone fought for. When I went to Alsace-Lorraine, much after the Cold War was over, there wasn't even a train stop at Alsace-Lorraine. It was just forgotten. It's also at some point as a bridge, bringing countries together. In the India-China case, or the India-Pakistan case, again, I think this symptomatic as well as sources. In the India-Pakistan question, often Kashmir is seen as a border problem. Pakistan says it's the unfinished act of partition. But India sees it as structural. that here is a Muslim majority state which acceded to India, and therefore defeated the whole idea of Pakistan that two nations couldn't survive together. So it's not a border problem. It's symptomatic of a deeper structural, ideological, Manichaean clash. In the India-China case, if you look at the different stages post-independence, you have India gaining independence in 47, the Chinese Mao's revolution in 1949. At that stage, the Chinese kind of deriding the Indian independence as a kind of petty bourgeois reform movement, and describing Nehru as a running dog of imperialism and all the kind of chosen epithets that they used to use for all the non-communist leaders. But Nehru firmly believed, that period is interesting, believed that India and China, emerging after 150 years of so-called Western humiliation, could, in their own way, serve as models, as leaders. And that the border question was not something that was zero-sum to a point where it would lead to a conflict. However, the Chinese reading, and if you look at the archives within the National Security Archives within America, some of the other archives from Britain, that the Chinese reading of India and the conversations that Kissinger had with Mao, those are fascinating. The Chinese had a patronizing attitude towards India. They never saw India as an equal. In fact, Mao describes to Kissinger, oh, India is like a cow, which is sometimes useful, but usually has to be driven in a particular direction, and sometimes can follow its own path, but is really bulky and not very useful. That's his exact description of India to Kissinger. So Nehru was seen as really leader of a lazy nation. And here was China, after the long march, embarking on the Great Leap Forward, but we know the consequences of the Great Leap Forward. So psychologically, for China, it was important to demonstrate that India was not in the same league. At Bandung, this is clearly brought out because Nehru tries to patronize Zhou Enlai by trying to introduce him to the other leaders of the Afro-Asian world, Sukarno, Nasser, Tito, while Zhou Enlai doesn't take very kindly to this whole attitude because they see themselves as really the champions, as the alternative model. And Nehru and non-alignment is seen as a bit of a wishy-washy way of trying to find a middle ground between socialism and capitalism, which doesn't gel. So the border issue becomes symptomatic of this deeper urge for China to play what they think is a natural role in Asia and even in Africa and Latin America. It happens also when the Chinese want to send a message to the Soviet Union, because it's on the cusp of the Sino-Soviet split. The Sino-Soviet split happens in the early 60s, and this happens just on that cusp. Simultaneously, Nehru decides, and genuinely rightly so, in my view, to recognize Chinese sovereignty over Tibet. That's not the one which I agree with, but to allow refuge to the Dalai Lama, which again, the Chinese don't take kindly to. So the border issue is really symptomatic of a gradual worsening of relations, which began on this high point where Nehru tries to sell the idea of Afro-Asian unity and the leadership of this new world led by India and China, to tensions growing where China doesn't see India in the same league and then sees India at best as an irritant which needs to be shown its place. And that irritant is also because of the Tibet question and because of the alacrity with which India, despite the alacrity with which India goes and appeases China and recognizes the Chinese sovereignty over Tibet. India also supports the Chinese case or the PRC's case as a permanent member of the UN Security Council. In fact, Nehruvian idealism was at its peak when India was in fact offered a seat in, they say, in the Security Council as a way, instead of China at that stage. No, Nehru says, no, 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 that's China's seat. Sure. The last time then, what happens is that in 1959, 1960, there is a worsening of relations. Zhao in Pillai visits India in, I think, 61 and offers this package deal, which in retrospect, many sinologists argue was the best deal you could have got, which is recognizing that China will recognize the McMahon line in the east as long as India concedes Chinese claims on the west, which is the Aksai Chin Plateau. So Tawang would be part of the Indian frontier, while Aksai Chin would be conceded to China. But the domestic political conditions do not allow Nehru to make that concession. And frankly, he himself believes that this is just a Chinese way of exercising pressure. And he has great faith in the Indian Army's ability to confront the Chinese, almost as much as Raji's faith today for us to confront the Chinese in Galwan. But having said that, we faced the worst humiliation in that war. The shadow of that war, the cost of that war, that 62 war, still haunts us. The best kind of pictorial description of that war was by Chetan Anand in a film called Hakikat, which you should all see, because that's, as Bollywood movies go, it's a fairly accurate description of what happened. We lost that war. We were humiliated. We had Anglo-Indian general who migrated to Australia and produced a report called the now known as Henderson Brooks report, which looked at the causes of the defeat for the Indian Army. And everyone, when I was a scholar in JNU and later on, everyone said, release the Henderson Brooks report. What does the Henderson Brooks report tell you? Henderson Brooks reports will tell you common sense, that you were not prepared for a war that you were decided to fight, that your army wasn't equipped, your logistics weren't in place, you fought a war on Chinese terms. And you had clearly, therefore, to lose that war. Now, for that period, then, the Chinese had this huge psychological advantage, even though economically they were far less robust than they are today. The border becomes symptomatic of Chinese aggressive designs and psychological designs of a larger interplay of ideology and influence across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Between 62 and 67, except for the incidents in Sikkim and Nathula, you really have a period of quiescence, even though the Chinese support insurgencies in India, the Naga insurgency, and some of the other insurgencies in the Northeast. You have a period of quiescence which continues well into the 80s. In the 71 war, the Chinese, for all their all-weather friendship with Pakistan, do not really help the Pakistanis at all. Yeah. I'll tell you an incident, since we can have a relaxed conversation. One of our great teachers in JNU was someone called G.P. Deshpande. He said, if someone had asked me about what the Chinese will do, I'd say read the statement, because the Chinese issued a statement saying India is an aggressor, India is responsible for this war, India has been supporting the Mukti Bahani, India is trying to annex or create a new state in Bangladesh. And then there's this caveat saying, as always, China will aid its all-weather ally. Always meant that you'll do it as you did in 65, which is just make a lot of noise and do nothing at all. Like in all previous occasions, whenever there had been a bilateral issue between India and Pakistan, there was an as always. So as always was a reference to a past where the Chinese postured a lot, but really did very little on the ground.
Right.
So the breakthrough comes in the 80s, as you know, where Rajiv Gandhi, first he sends P.N. Haksar, and there are quiet delegations. There's a track 2 movement. Track 2 works very well despite everything people might say against it. So he sends P.N. Haksar, a trusted aide, of course, with the natural brilliance that Kashmiri pundits can bring to conversations like this. So he sends him there. There is a breakthrough. And you've had tranquility and peace and tranquility since that period, with some degrees of confusion, but gradually fleshing out of those agreements in various iterations of that argument, defining almost everything of what you can do and not do in the LSC. If you do this, then you should report, etc., etc. Then this continues. What changes? What changes in the last 3 years? Levels of analysis is something that you, Arpit, were taught in as a 101 undergraduate political science. Yeah. Levels of analysis, systemic. India is cozying up to the United States. It's no longer hedging. It's a short of aligning. It's doing everything else. It's talking the language of the Americans in terms of the Quad. It's talking about rule-based order in the Quad, a new architecture. It's taking a position which is close to what the Americans would have us in the South China Sea. So at the systemic level, India is seen as becoming much closer to the United States, especially at a time when the Chinese no longer believe that they need to just need to bide their time. Like Deng Xiaoping said, in the 24-character strategy, bide your time, concentrate your internal developments, your time will come. Xi Jinping says our time has come. But systemic level, there is, whether you believe in the Thucydides paradox about a rising power and an emerging power and how there is an inevitability of a clash, or whether you take another more sophisticated realist paradigm, systemic level, this is happening. At the domestic level, there is a feeling that the Indians are asserting themselves, exercising themselves in terms of trying to have a relationship which is not equal to what the Chinese would want in terms of the economic relationship. They're adding caveats, although the Indians, unlike the Australians or the New Zealanders, agreed to have who we as at least tender for our tender, which itself was a huge concession. And then, of course, at leadership level, Xi Jinping is the most authoritarian leader since Mao, even more authoritarian. If you were a student or if you're a official in the Chinese Communist Party, you'd have to read up while you're taking the tram or any other form of public transport. You'll have to go through your smartphone and read up Xi Jinping's thought. It's like the Red Book. Xi is the new face of China. His wife is this glamorous major general in the Chinese army, and who is a singer by training, but she has the designation of a major general. They are the most powerful couple. And he has successfully eliminated all his rivals. I knew Bo Xilai, who was one of the emerging leaders, but the manner in which he crushed Bo Xilai demonstrated how domestically he could be so ruthless. And so internationally, he's emerging similarly ruthless, as a similarly ruthless leader. And China, at this time, when they think that India is cozying up to the United States, is asserting itself economically, has a strong leadership, wants to send a message across. Simultaneously, on the border, as you pointed out, India was when Manmohan Singh was Prime Minister, he sent Shyam Saran, and subsequent to that, we built some of the border infrastructure. There was a fair weather road which they intended to build from Leh to Daulat Beg Oldie, which is the last post on the frontier, as a way of not competing with, but as a way of demonstrating that at least our infrastructure is somehow parallel to what you're building in terms of the Karakoram highway.
Right.
Given all these factors, again, as I said, border in this case is symptomatic, partly a cause, but largely symptomatic of a new low in Indo-China relations caused by other factors. The tragedy is unlike uh, Rajiv, who who has given credit to the foresight of some of our uh, notables in the foreign service. I think they just got it wrong. The sinologists have the biggest liability, biggest millstone around India's neck. There is a general millstone around everyone's neck because they have taken such a benign Confucian view of China, or China is driven by the whole idea of China as a peaceful rise. The whole idea of China is obey the state, be loyal to the family. And people like Kishore Mahbubani, who says, oh, no, look, the Chinese, when they rule the world, they'll be really not making you eat with chopsticks and won't want you to say ni hao every morning to them, but there is a gentle kind of tributary system. As long as I can salute you in the morning, and they'll be happy with it. The fact of the matter remains, it is the biggest challenge India has faced. And not to have recognized it as such 30 years ago is the biggest failure of Indian foreign policy. It's the biggest failure of Indian academia, only to a second level, because academics are not trained to decide policy or devise policy. For Indian sinologists who sat in the Foreign Office and who sat in the China study group, not to have seen this happening, it's playing havoc with our national interest. Let me stop there after these long, slightly meandering remarks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Mathu. Just one small follow-up question. That is, what about the second level of analysis? How much do you think that the domestic politics in India, with Modi coming in, with BJP coming in with a strong nationalistic agenda, how much has that changed India's policy? Because I agree, as you said, that there have been structural moves towards the US for India, but how much were they? How much was the domestic scenario a catalyst to that?
I think the fact that you have a strong leadership in India, together with a more autarkic view of economic issues, which means a more, even before self-reliance became a buzzword, there was a certain, the Swadeshi Jagran Manch, which is a very important player in the Sangh Parivar, had advocated a more self-driven economic model. More importantly, the fact that Xi Jinping wants to demonstrate internally within the Communist Party and the PLA that he's unchallenged. And this whole idea that suddenly there'll be a democratic coup is a flight of fancy. The reality is, for all the various kinds of, on the one hand, you have the global times where you try and understand Chinese opinion through global times. On the other hand, you have propaganda tools of the American agencies which try and tell you that China is just waiting to implode. Now, I've heard that for the last 30 years, it's not imploded. That the provinces are in the coastal regions are doing well, the hinterland is in terrible shape, the PLA is, there's internal dissension. They said this after Pillai was eliminated. They are saying it even now. The Central Committee is going to rise up in arms, and the PLA, he doesn't have the control of the PLA, despite being the vice chairman of the military commission. He is, that's nonsense. I think
kind of wishful thinking.
It's wishful thinking. It's hoping. Unless he were to fall dead tomorrow, Xi Jinping, there's no question that compared to Abe or Modi or any other leader, he's more authoritarian, more powerful, more influential, and has greater control. He doesn't even have a Rahul Gandhi to contend with.
Okay, and on that note, I'm gonna move to Sylvia. And Sylvia, since you're in DC, I want to know, to what extent do you think that, what's the perception over there between this India and China conflict? And just generally, if you could talk a little bit about, do you think that India's hardened its balancing strategy in a way? And to what extent do you think that this, Quad or Quad Plus going to define India's new approach towards China? Yeah, that's my question. Over to you, Sylvia.
Thank you, Arpit, for your questions. And I really wanted to appreciate all the encouraging words from both Dr. Gopalan and Professor Mathu, and also really learned from your informed remarks. Regarding strengthening and hardening of balancing posture, I think every crisis provides different countries potential or room to one, reassess its own policies, second, reorient its policies possibly, and thirdly, reinvent. And I would want to explain these three R's. I feel that during this India-China standoff, there is an overwhelming degree of commonality of and convergence of opinion that India should be reassessing its China policy. And Raji has rightly pointed to this remark, saying that there are a lot of national security vanguards and distinguished experts who say that we really need to take one hard look at what our China policy has been. When I talk about, secondly, reorient our China policy, what I'm trying to get at is it's important for India to really, once again, understand who are its real friends are, who are its strategic partners in the region, and what India can actually afford to do within the present extenuating circumstances where we have hostile borders on both our eastern and western fronts. And third is reinvent. When I talk about reinvention, I'm trying to explain to our audience that China has been, during the last 30 years, spending a lot, massive amounts of military budget towards creating a military and defense infrastructure ecosystem. And that really has widened the power gaps and widened the power equations between India and China. And this is not only just the case with India and China. Taking advantage of the rules-based order that the United States provided since Second World War, China has been able to develop and build its capabilities. But one thing one should keep in mind is that China does not want to play a game of symmetry. I feel China's policies towards India and China's policies towards United States, which is actually going to shape and reorder the Asian balance of power, is premised on building in asymmetries between the power equations. And let me explain and elaborate on this a bit. So when I talk about power asymmetries inbuilt in the US-China equation, I mean that China has not been focused on building a conventional or strategic. When I say strategic, I'm talking about the nuclear balance vis-a-vis China and the United States. China has not been interested in having a parity with the United States. Instead, what China has done over the last 30 years is build capabilities which actually target United States conventional deterrence capabilities. It has been able to take advantage of building several asymmetric technologies and asymmetric capabilities, which essentially is able to integrate and almost dismantle the United States battle field or battle network. A recent book by Christian Bose is talking about what is the American kill chain and how the American kill chain can be defended in terms of this aggrandizing Chinese capabilities of asymmetric military capabilities. And let me give you an example. China has been building and fielding underwater drones. These underwater drones are able to for the time being, China has been maintaining that these underwater drones, which are being deployed in South China Sea or in the Indian Ocean, are able to collect data or is able to gather intelligence for civilian purposes. But however, we know, and a recent RAND report has also stated that China is able to build these fleet of underwater drone technologies, which are also able to carry a payload. For the time being, these underwater drones are able to carry a conventional payload, but as we know, Russia is developing underwater drone capability, which is able to carry a nuclear tipped torpedo. So we know that China has been building some of these and deploying and fielding some of these emerging technologies, which essentially changes the changes a lot of the power equations with also the United States. So, so the United States strategy of late has been, it has declared China as a peer competitor, and it is looking at regaining some, even though it is one of the strongest military powers, still the United States national defense security policy entails and states that it would want to gain back a conventional superiority vis-a-vis China in the Western Pacific and the Indo-Pacific region. Again, when we are talking about power asymmetries in the China-India context, we know that China has a massive advantage. It has been building up infrastructure along the lines. I would really ask our audience to take a look at the amazing report that Raji has authored on border infrastructure development, and especially along LSE and Tibet region. So again, on that front, China has built in with deliberate maneuvering and strategy certain essential asymmetries vis-a-vis India. For example, they have better infrastructure along the border. They have a first mover advantage. When I say first mover advantage, I mean India is mostly on the defensive side. It is defending the border, but however, we know that China is a revisionist power. It is not a status quo power. It is trying to change realities on the ground along the LAC. Again, so it has an advantage vis-a-vis India on that. And most importantly, and something that is extremely concerning for us is China's relationship and its ability to leverage the relationship with Pakistan along the borders. So along with certain other issues like higher ground for advantage and some of the natural advantages that China has gotten due to geographies, there are certain inbuilt asymmetries. So talking about these asymmetries, it just comes to the fore that India has to partner with like-minded countries and do a certain degree of burden sharing if it effectively wants to check and prevent China's rise. And I would not use the word contain, but essentially to deter a expansionist China, which is really bent on bullying and trying to change the status quo on ground. With regards to what has been happening in the last few months on the India-US framework, both the countries and the bedrock of relationship has really been an alignment of security interest in the Indo-Pacific region. But saying that, I have to also include that bilateral ties between India and the United States are multifaceted. In the last 3 months, we have seen that US tech giants, as they are trying to compete with China digitally, have announced and have like promised investments in India worth 40 billion. Now that is a huge investment, and that also goes to show that India and the United States would be partnering on several key important issues like biotechnology, artificial intelligence, clean energy. So our relationship is pretty diversified, but at the heart of our commonalities and convergences of interest lies our desire to see that Indo-Pacific region is rules-based and no one country dominate the region. And saying that, I just want to underscore that COVID-19 situation has once again reinforced and consolidated in a way India-US bilateral ties, because both the countries have been able to understand and realize the the great concern that China poses when it comes to the interdependence, when it comes to the global supply lines. On that front, again, India and the United States have been doing a lot of work. As we know, like India has been able to successfully deliver medical supplies to the United States during these trying times. So whilst we understand the relationship is multifaceted, but more importantly, there has been a lot of developments that has been afoot on the defense and the military side of things. Raji has already spoken about a lot of the developments on the Quad, but I would say a lot of the more interesting developments are also happening on a bilateral front. Both the countries have are again cooperating on defense procurement issues. India has, during President Trump's visit in during February, has once again expressed its desire to acquire like maritime surveillance capabilities, because to keep a check in the Indian Ocean region, and also I think issued an order of 100 anti-ship Harpoon missiles. So the ledger of defense procurements from the United States goes on. But some of the more interesting aspects to the defense and security cooperation bit is really the focus on intelligence sharing. A lot of senior experts have mentioned that it is important for India and the United States to have a more structured and institutional approach towards intelligence sharing. And in this, India and the United States have already walked a certain mile. India has signed the COMCASA, and it is going to discussions on BECA, which is the basic exchange security. It's a mouthful. I'll get back to you. But on that, so BECA is again a logistic intelligence sharing arrangement framework with the United States. So a lot of some of these developments are underway, which essentially goes to show that India would like to consolidate and partner greatly with the United States and other like-minded countries. One recent development which I found extremely important, and it also gained a bit of traction in Indian media, is Adam Schiffer, who is a congressman and is the secretary for the House permanent representative on intelligence affair. He has come out and said that the United States would like to see India, South Korea, and Japan in the Five Eyes framework. Now, Five Eyes is a intelligence sharing framework / mechanism consisting of United States and its other strategic and treaty ally partners like United Kingdom, France, Australia, New Zealand, and there's another country. But to expand Five Eyes and to get India on board is going to be extremely important, because we want more synergy with United States and like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific, because we want a more integrated view of the battlefield, right? We are trying to do more burden sharing when it comes to naval activities in the Indo-Pacific. So some of these developments are going to actually shape the balance of power in the coming years in the Indo-Pacific region. But at the core of it really comes to the fact that how these countries are able to manage their differences. And I know both Professor Mathu and Raji did allude to the irritant in the US India relationship of that with Russia. And I would love to come back and answer more on the CATSA, which is countering America's adversaries through Sanctions Act. This is something that the United States launched in 2017, essentially to reprimand, in a way, countries like China and Turkey, who are procuring S-400 from Russia. So now in 2019, India has demanded from Russia to procure these S-400 worth 5.5 billion. And so it is going to be interesting to see how India and the United States is able to manage some of these differences and irritants in its relationship, as and how it strengthens its bilateral defense sharing framework. I'll stop at that and I'll take more questions from you later.
Thank you, Sylvia. Just a quick observation and a question to both you and Professor Rajagopalan. You both seem to agree that there is certainly an absolute, unquestionable wide power differential between China and India, and China is, kind of it's being the bully. And I also heard Professor Mathu say that it's kind of throwing its weight around. But I also, that seems to be quite a consensus in the academic circles. But when you talk to a lot of politicians, for example, they would say that the current belligerence is because China's insecurity, because that power differential is closing up. So to what extent would you agree with that, Sylvia? And if Professor Rajagopalan could also answer that, is the belligerence because of the differential closing up, or is it just China being the bully?
I think Professor Mathu really spoke and explained the answer to your question, talking and referring in his quintessential Professor Avatar about the systemic conditions that essentially leads to the rise of China. And I completely agree with him. It is just not, it has been a deliberate and a very thought out strategy for the last 3 decades. And a lot of that also goes to like some of the inbuilt structural conditions of our international politics right now. But saying that, I think one of the key issues that really has suddenly brought these differences into sharper focus is as and how China's has been rising economically. It has been able to throw its weight around also militarily. Saying that this idea of power projection and having a blue water navy, which is able to have like, its presence in the far waters of Indo-Pacific region, this has somewhat gotten a lot of issues in sharper focus in the immediate future. And again, this also goes on to saying that China's ability and ways to change the status quo on ground by building artificial islands and claiming the 9-dash line. So a lot of these things do and has brought some of these issues into sharper focus in the last 5 to 7 years, I would say. But saying that, I would allude to what Professor Mathu is saying about this rise of China is also very systemic in nature. I would love to listen to both Professor and Dr. Rajagopalan on their responses to this question.
Can I just,
do you want to take
yeah, sure, absolutely. I think it's a mix of two in a sense. And at some level, I would agree with Professor Mathu when he says that this is only a symptom issue in a sense. I agree with the first part because it is a symptom of a larger problem that exists between India and China. And the larger question is, can China live with an India that is also rising at the same time? Can China live with the rising Japan at the same time? A return to a normal nation in Japan. Can China live with that? My own sense, and I have been looking at this issue for a while, and sense is that China has a very exclusive framework to the whole emerging Asian strategic framework and so on and so forth. So that exclusivist framework where it believes its rise is a very natural phenomenon, the Middle Kingdom syndrome. So its rise is a natural phenomena, but seeing any other peers, sure, there is a huge power differential that we are 2 or 3 generations behind China when it comes to economic power, the military, and so on and so forth. But the fact is that even a marginal rise of India is seen as a serious problem by China, and therefore China is not willing to see any other power that is rising at the same time. This goes against, for instance, India and Japan, for instance, to a large extent, has a very inclusive framework. So which is you are willing to see 2 or 3 rising powers at the same time. That is completely against against the China's approach, where it doesn't want to see any peer competition that is kind of emerging at the same time. And I think some of the other points, if I can just quickly talk about it, I don't think the Indian Army is ready. And I didn't say that we were ready for any kind of sort of a take on the LAC, because precisely the point I said, India always has had the defensive framework approach to looking at China. So we are not ready yet. If forced to, we will fight with what we have, like famously former Army Chief General Malik said, but we are not really looking at the kind of deficiencies, both in terms of the equipments and weapon systems, but also in terms of the Sino-Indian border infrastructure, which is in a really, really pathetic situation. So let me not get into a very lengthy answer at this point of time. I think we are running also short of time. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So one question that has been coming up from the audience for Dr. Mathu again and again, and I'm going to pose it to you, sir. That is that, what about the trade side? How does India completely banning trade from China? Do you think that's on the table, or do you think there's any value to that sort of a strategic prescription?
There was a feeling, as you know, there was a section of thinking within India and internationally, and within people who study international relations, that economic interdependence creates the conditions for greater stability. It moderates decision-making, there's a certain moderation of public opinion. That, fortunately, does not seem to have worked tremendously well, even though China is India's first or second largest trading partner, depending on how you measure trade. Now, I find it, the idea of decoupling in terms of trade, very attractive. But I find that there's a huge gulf between translating that idea into reality, because supply chains to move out and to decouple themselves from China is easier said than done. I mean, you'll have to incentivize the big companies in a manner in which they find it cheaper or more competitive to do business out of China. I mean, this is capitalism. You can't suddenly decide that big business will give up its profits if it can do business with China for the sake of some ideology or some threat. The very fact that you have cheap labor still available in China, conditions of political and economic stability still operating in China, and a growing internal demand within China is the reason why capitalism invests in China. It's not because they like the Chinese more than they like the Indians. You offer the same climate in India. Economic stability doesn't mean that you will be back-taxed, or there'll be demonetization, or there'll be a new tax regime. You offer political stability and you offer cheap, skilled labor, and capital will move. Of course, you can incentivize this by telling the Microsoft or the big companies which operate out of China, look, we'll offer you a better tax regime if you decouple, etc. But it's not easy. Remember, capitalism drives policy more often than policy driving capitalism. So that is a, and I cannot, for instance, I've been trying to track through a consumer how fast we have moved out of relying on China. True, software application TikTok, you can't now sing or dance to TikTok. But if you go to Khan Market, you go to, in fact, you are a good test study. All the chandeliers, all the glass products, all the used to, from in Bhagirath Palace, which is the center of, it was from China. Now tell me, has the glass industry revived in Firozabad? Has the manufacturing industry in the last 2 months revived to a point that it can take on China? Give me, I mean, that's an anecdotal example, but in a good example.
Rather the opposite, I'd say. I mean, the chandelier industry became dependent on China since the 1990s. That was almost a third of what Firozabad as a city used to produce. And it doesn't seem to be changing anymore right now. And I was also thinking, India constitutes what 2 to 3% of China's exports. So I don't see how much. Yeah.
It's not easy. All I'm saying is that yes, recognize that China is a rogue. Okay, if you want to call it a rogue, call it. But the fact that you can easily tame this roguish dragon is not going to be easy, because today, for all the reasons that have been articulated by Sylvia and Raji, that it made use of American laws, it made use of course, just tells you how foolish the Americans were to allow a preferential regime which allowed China to access their R&D, manufacture in China. But the fact of the matter remains that China today is in a position where it will take a huge amount of effort. I mean, all these ideas are brilliant ideas. Five Eyes, for instance, of real-time intelligence sharing. But I'll change my name the Americans offer you Five Eyes. And you can decide, Sylvia, you can decide what I should be called in a identity protection program that you Americans might have. But I'm ready to change my name the day India is included, along with Canada, Australia, England, Australia, New Zealand, and England as Five Eyes. Real-time intelligence sharing, you know which operative has gone where. You just get you get raw data. You can interpret it. If they start doing that, then I'll say that is a giant leap of faith. And the biggest elephant in the room no one's talked about, President Donald Trump. Now, you might like to believe, again, in terms of your systemic analysis, but great actors in this whole great men in history is a wasted argument. Even if there wasn't a Trump, it's going to be same. Or fact is that Trump, being Trump, has played havoc with this relationship. Look at the number of H-1B visa holders who are not sure whether they can continue to stay in America. So America first has also played India second as far as the relationship goes. So frankly, but with Joe Biden comes the whole baggage of non-proliferation, human rights, Kashmir, all the other Pakistan lobbyists who got to him before we got Trump to the Motera Stadium. So all I'm saying is that there are huge variables. We all agree that China is a problem. We all agree that I think quite clearly in terms of balance of power theory, you can't internally balance it. You don't have the capacities on your own to balance China. You might have to therefore use external balancing like through the Quad and other actors, Quad Plus. The time for hedging as far as China goes is over. You can't bandwagon with China and say, okay, we won't join the Americans, please treat us, we'll pay a tribute every month if you want, but let's become your junior partner. That's not an option. It's not psychologically an option. Is autonomy of some form, trying to balance, navigate, carve a path through all this? I don't know. Frankly, no one's thought these things through. You began the question about grand strategy. Grand strategy requires a 30-year vision. Unfortunately, if you had a 30-year vision, we wouldn't have landed in Galvan the way we have today. Notwithstanding the brilliance of all our foreign policy thinkers and incisive analysts within the establishment and outside it. What is fantastic, however, is someone should write a PhD thesis on, is how intelligent, wise, and counterintuitive they become the moment they superannuate from their service.
Sure. I think the PhD aspirants in the room have some tips over there. Okay, so I think I'll just take one last question, and it's directed towards Professor Rajagopalan. And the question is that how much do you, to what extent do you think that India can counterbalance China with its near border strategies, especially relations with Nepal, Bangladesh, and what about NAM? Do you think reinvigorating NAM is going to make any difference to the situation? Okay, just a second. I think Aditi, you have to unmute Raji if you could do that, please.
Okay, now I couldn't do that. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks.
Done. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for that question. And I think it's been a fascinating number of questions that have come on the chat box. So I'll try and link up a couple of those questions as well.
Sure.
But I think one or two broader points I want to say. I think the whole world, a lot of the big powers did believe that China will open up, even politically, become more liberalized in political terms once they acquired certain amount of economic competitiveness. But I think that's an assumption that a lot of countries have made, not just the United States, but China did provide the incentive for the rest of the world to come, park their money, put their investment, give the best of technology, clean, green, all of that. Why isn't India doing that? Nobody has stopped India from doing it. Even recently, I think External Affairs Minister were talking giving an interview. He talked about it, saying that we have recognized these are the problems, but the problem has been mainly in terms of scaling it, and so on and so forth. So we have serious problems. I think we should understand that. But in terms of the decoupling aspect that was talked about of me a few minutes ago, again, India doesn't really stand a chance at this point of time, given the kind of land acquisition issue, the bureaucracy, the red tape, is a whole range of issues. You don't really stand a chance in a sense. You may, I think Chief Minister Yogi Adityanath, UP Chief Minister, did make a statement to say that we are going to invite a whole lot of companies who are moving out of China, but that just, it amazed me as to how do you even make such kind of statements so full of there is no substance to that meeting. In fact, on the other hand, Vietnam has emerged as one of the more competitive player in this regard, able to take advantage of that. Japan is offering so many incentives. We haven't done a lot of things. We have been doing a lot of rhetoric with very little delivery, and I think that's been part of the problem. Second, one broad point that I want to make is I think a lot of some of the questions also relate to this, that India moving closer to the US has been part of this problem with China. And I think that's a very false notion that we have developed. That's a very lazy argument, I would say, to say that everything, just dump it on the US and say India has gone close to the US and that's why the problem with China. I think we were not close to the Americans for the longest time. Yet we had this problem with China from long ago. Maybe it became magnified in the last 15 years or so. But I think the problem with China, between India and China, and the Chinese efforts at sort of limiting India to play a regional role in Southern Asia, South Asia at best, started way back in the late 1950s and 60s. So this is nothing new. And in those times, China's interests converged the most with Pakistan, but today China has been able to take advantage of much of India's neighborhood to bring it there. And I think that again relates to some of the problem questions again. India's own standing in the Southern Asian neighborhood, how it has become very, very difficult. India is really put to test, whether it is Nepal, whether it is Pakistan, Bangladesh. Again, some of these have been because of our own doing. CAA development related to the CAA Citizenship Amendment Act has led to a lot of the problems that we face with Bangladesh. Otherwise, this is one government with whom even Modi government had established fairly decent relationship, a very constructive, very prosperous relationship, but that we have damaged because of the CAA. That's something our own doing. Nepal, again, we haven't been particularly magnanimous with many of our neighbors in the way we treat our neighbors. That has been part of the problem. Sri Lanka, it's the right recipe out there for more problems out there, because now the Rajapaksas are back in town. Many of the projects that India signed with Sri Lanka, India and Japan signed together, all of those are under question on shaky grounds. So the neighborhood, except for Maldives, it doesn't look to be very promising at this point of time. In fact, again, External Affairs Minister talking about this, he said we should have structural institutional mechanisms so that the internal politics and other factors, they do not affect this. If you have a institutional arrangement between various countries on various collaborative agendas, then these kind of, because many of these countries are playing into India-China politics, or they're trying to get the better out of the two countries and so on and so forth. All of this different, or even the domestic agenda, domestic political agenda that is coming into play. These things will not affect India's relations with each of these countries if we had an institutional mechanisms. Yes, to some extent that might be true, but I think we need to learn better in terms of how we manage our neighbors. We are the biggest country sharing borders with almost everybody. If we don't have a big heart and being magnanimous, we are going to have this a very tough neighborhood to go along in a sense. What we are seeing with regard to China today is that it is extremely impatient in country. China will come to become a superpower, a number one power, number two power, and so on and so forth with varying stages. But today, China believes that it has already reached there, and China seems to be in a big hurry to get to the high table and sit and dictate to the rest of the world as to how the world should be run. And China has already been making some of these moves, especially on the economic front, especially coming up with mechanisms such as the NDB, the National Development Bank, through the BRICS, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and so on and so forth. These have been some of the on the economic front, they have been taking these measures, but I think they just do not have the credibility when it comes to international political or security scenario to kind of come up with mechanisms of that kind or institutional initiatives, proposals of that kind that can gain them certain credibility. But I think the problem is that you have an impatient and a paranoia nation on your right, and that's a really bad combination. And the fact that I think you have a bigger problem. One is the changing balance of power equations, against Sylvia referred to it, and that's been part of the problem. So even as the US continues to be the most dominant power, you have a relative decline of the US. And I think that has had a determining say in how the Indo-Pacific affairs are also being shaped today. Second, you have the rising Asia with China, India, and the rise of a new normal Japan. You have the reemergence of Russia. These are all part of the, again, problem. And the problem is compounded because each of these major powers, when you look at it, they also have unresolved border and territorial issues, baggage of history, with each of these countries having gone into war with each other: China, India, China, Japan, China, Russia. So even though China and Russia appear to have one of the better faces in their relationship today, there are mutual skepticism. Russia remains extremely apprehensive of the kind of muscular China that it is becoming. So there are serious problems of that kind: the baggage of history, unresolved sovereignty and territorial issues. Each of these are going to weigh very strongly in the Indo-Pacific security and dynamics, in a sense. So unfortunately, what we are going to see in Asia or the Indo-Pacific region is that it's going to be an extremely tensed, competitive, the potential for conflict is absolutely ripe. I will not put past that they've not. When you had Doklam 3 years ago, a lot of people said, okay, Doklam was an aberration, that Doklam is not the first and the last. But I think it's not the end of it. I think there are going to be peaceful rise of China all that mantra happened. But I think it has been very clear that an aggressive China who's impatient and paranoia, you're going to have serious problems. And unless you bring in all the different like-minded countries to come together and shape an Indo-Pacific narrative that has respect for a rule-based order and use of dialogue and dialogue as a means to resolve issues, you're going to run into serious problems in the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Raji, for that insightful response. And with this, we come to an end of today's discussion. We did a deep dive into this topic. Thank you so much, Sylvia. Thank you so much, Professor Mathu and Professor Gopalan. I think lots of questions still, coming in the chat box.
Yeah.
I need to apologize to a lot of people in here because we did not have enough time, especially Mr. Pradeep Mukhopadhyay. I agree with you that, you had some questions and we had to, if you write to us on info@Global Policy Insights, we'll forward your questions to Sylvia, and Sylvia, if you could be so kind enough to respond to that. But, with this, we come to our the end of the first seminar on organized by the Indian Women for International Relations. Now, just to reiterate, our vision behind this was, I still remember not, long back, I was at Professor Mathu's place, and I asked him that, Professor Mathu, am I wrong in observing that India has a lot of, it's produced a lot of economists who are so well known across the world, and somehow the number of IR thinkers from India is still quite limited. And Professor Mathu graciously answered my question, and he answered in affirmative, telling me that indeed that is certainly true. And then that got me thinking, and, Sylvia and I, and the others in the IWIR team, what it is now, we started discussing that, not only are there, is there a lack of Indians in the whole IR narrative across the world? There's also a serious lack in Indian women voices, being heard and being amplified. And that was the whole idea behind IWIR. And I hope that it goes a long way in fulfilling its mission. And thank you so much again to everybody in the audience, to our panelists here for giving it your support. Thank you. You have a nice evening. You have a nice day wherever you are. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.